You wake up every morning and the world already demands your attention. Notifications flash before your eyes, the mind fills with unfinished thoughts, and the heart quietly whispers that something is missing. You read scripture, you pray, but still, there's noise, a constant hum that blurs the edges of God's voice. It's not that he's silent, it's that the frequency of your life no longer matches his. The modern mind is rarely still enough to perceive the divine. Yet beneath the static, the Spirit is speaking, patiently, rhythmically, waiting for your awareness to remember how to listen. Hearing God isn't about achieving a supernatural moment. It's about retraining your attention, aligning your inner rhythm with His. Just as the brain can rewire through repetition, the soul can rediscover clarity through consistent presence. This daily rhythm, anchored in scripture, silence, and awareness, isn't a religious exercise. It's a neurological and spiritual realignment. The voice of God doesn't compete with chaos. It waits for rhythm, for stillness, for the moment you finally stop chasing and begin to dwell. Every heartbeat, every breath, every verse you take in becomes a doorway. When you start to live by rhythm rather than reaction, divine clarity isn't something you seek. It becomes the atmosphere you breathe. The noise doesn't disappear. It simply loses power. In this rhythm, the veil thins, and you begin to hear not only with your ears, but with your entire being. The sound of silence that modern life forgot. There was a time when silence wasn't something we feared. It was the natural rhythm of dawn, the quiet breath between one thought and another, the space where the soul could expand. But now silence feels foreign, even threatening. We fill every pause with sound. Music, scrolling, conversation, noise. Our minds have become echo chambers of urgency, replaying unfinished tasks and unprocessed emotions until the inner world becomes louder than the outer one. What we've forgotten is that silence isn't the absence of life. It's the environment where life begins to make sense. It's the sacred space where the human mind and the divine spirit can meet without interference. The brain, wired for constant stimulation, starts to crave noise like a drug. Andrew Huberman would tell you this is dopamine dysregulation, the constant need for external input to feel alive. Yet the paradox is that the voice we most need to hear only speaks in frequencies quiet enough for stillness to receive. When you start to reintroduce silence into your daily rhythm, something profound happens. The chaos doesn't vanish overnight, but it begins to reorganize itself. The mind, once scattered, starts to gather its fragments. You start hearing not with your ears, but with awareness itself. Judith Beck might call this cognitive restructuring, but spiritually it's something deeper. It's remembrance. The silence you resist is the very space where God has been waiting. And as you begin to honor it, a new kind of rhythm takes root, one that tunes your inner life back to divine order. When the mind becomes too loud for God, the modern mind rarely stops. It spins relentlessly, an engine of unfinished thoughts, comparisons, predictions, and fears. Every moment of stillness is invaded by invisible noise. We replay yesterday's mistakes, anticipate tomorrow's struggles, and drown in a constant hum of mental static. It's not that God stopped speaking, it's that our minds became too loud to notice He's been speaking all along. Neuroscience shows that when the brain is overstimulated, its sensory gates stay wide open. Dopamine and cortisol surge together, creating an endless loop of attention hijacking. Every notification, every anxious thought pulls the mind away from presence. Andrew Huberman would call this attentional fragmentation, the inability to maintain one coherent focus long enough for clarity to form. Spiritually, it feels like praying into the void. The words go up, but they seem to vanish before reaching heaven. God's voice doesn't fight for volume. It never shouts above your thoughts. It waits for space. This is why stillness isn't weakness. It's training. It's the slow rewiring of the nervous system to shift from reaction to awareness. As you learn to quiet your inner storm, the layers of distraction begin to peel away, and under them, you start to sense something familiar. That still, consistent whisper that speaks not to your ears, but to your being. When the mind becomes quiet, faith stops being an effort and becomes recognition. You don't create the connection, you remember it. Silence doesn't suppress thought, it restores focus. And in that focus, you begin to hear again. Not new words, but the same eternal truth spoken clearly for the first time in a long time. The forgotten language of rhythm. Everything in creation moves by rhythm. The ocean breathes in tides, the earth spins in cycles, the body beats in time with the heart. Even your thoughts, your emotions, your energy, all pulse with patterns. Yet somewhere in our rush for productivity and progress, we lost this ancient synchronization. Life became fragmented, disconnected from the divine tempo that holds everything together. And when rhythm is lost, clarity disappears with it. God has always spoken in rhythm, not chaos. From the first "let there be light" to the still small voice that guided the prophets, his communication has always followed a pattern: day and night, seed time and harvest, rest and renewal. It's no coincidence that Scripture calls for meditation day and night. Repetition isn't redundancy, it's design. The mind, through neuroplasticity, learns truth not through novelty, but through rhythm, through returning, remembering, reinforcing. When your days lose rhythm, your spirit loses resonance. You begin to live reactively instead of responsively. But when you rebuild sacred rhythm, even your biology begins to align. Cortisol drops, focus stabilizes, and awareness expands. What once felt like divine silence begins to hum again with familiar energy. You start to sense that God was never absent, your life was simply offbeat. The daily Bible rhythm isn't a formula, it's a tuning process. Each moment of scripture, prayer, or silence becomes a metronome that trains your heart back into harmony with God's pulse. Over time, your days stop feeling random. They start to flow. You're no longer trying to find God. You're moving in rhythm with Him. And in that flow, every thought, every breath becomes fluent in the language of divine presence. Jesus and the dawn habit. There's a reason the Gospels so often say, before daybreak, Jesus went to a solitary place to pray. It wasn't habit for the sake of holiness, it was rhythm for the sake of alignment. In the stillness before sunrise, the noise of the world hadn't yet awakened, and in that quiet, his spirit synchronized with the Father's will. Before the crowds, before the demands, before the miracles, there was silence. A divine calibration between human limitation and heavenly purpose. Modern neuroscience confirms what Scripture modeled 2,000 years ago. The brain at dawn is in a uniquely plastic and receptive state. It's the moment when cortisol is naturally elevated, focus is sharp, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of awareness, awakens. What Jesus practiced wasn't only spiritual, it was neurobiological wisdom. He met the Father when his mind was most capable of focus and his soul was untouched by distraction. This is where many lose the rhythm of divine communication. We rush into the day without alignment, allowing the world to define our mental tone. Yet the early morning is sacred ground, a meeting point between eternity and time. When you choose to begin your day in silence, scripture, or prayer before anything digital, you reclaim the same space Christ once inhabited, where divine instruction flows freely because the heart is tuned to receive it. In that first light, something profound happens. The inner noise quiets, perspective widens, and direction emerges without striving. You begin to live from intention instead of reaction. Just as the sun reorders darkness, your morning rhythm reorders the inner world. The question isn't whether God is speaking, it's whether you've created the stillness necessary to hear. The morning gate. Before the world wakes up. There's a sacred moment between night and day, when the air feels almost alive with anticipation. The body stirs, the mind hesitates between sleep and wakefulness, and the world hasn't yet demanded your attention. That moment, the first gate of the morning, is where your entire day is decided. Before a single thought is spoken, your mind begins building the architecture of your emotional state. It's in that fragile hour that your spirit either opens to peace or submits to chaos. The brain, in those first minutes after waking, is in what neuroscientists call a theta state, a liminal zone between the conscious and the subconscious. It's where imagination, memory, and focus are most pliable. When your first input is scripture, stillness, or prayer, you program the mind with coherence and direction. But when your first input is the world, social media, stress, news, you invite disorder to set the tone. It's not just spiritual advice, it's neurological conditioning. Before the world wakes up, heaven listens. This is when divine guidance is easiest to recognize because the mental static is lowest. It's the hour when inspiration feels closer, when clarity appears like light spreading over water. Each morning, you stand at that gate with a choice, to fill your awareness with noise or to shape it into presence. Those who choose silence before sound, scripture before scrolling, soon discover that God's whisper was never gone. It was simply waiting for the mind to become still enough to hear. What happens in that first hour doesn't just influence your mood, it rewires your rhythm. A peaceful beginning becomes momentum for the entire day. The mind learns to follow the pattern it awakens in. The morning gate is your invitation to start every day, not in reaction, but in rhythm, with God's voice setting the tone before the world ever gets the chance. Scripture as frequency, not text. Most people read the Bible as if it were a collection of words to analyze, memorize, or debate. But Scripture was never meant to be consumed only by the intellect. It was designed to resonate with the spirit. The words carry frequency. When spoken, whispered, or meditated upon, they don't just inform the mind, they rewire it. Every verse functions like a tuning fork for the soul, aligning scattered thoughts back to divine coherence. Neuroscience tells us that repetition and rhythm sculpt the brain through neuroplasticity. When you revisit the same scripture daily, not as study but as rhythm, you're training neural pathways toward peace, focus, and faith. The mind begins to echo what it consistently absorbs. Anxiety fades not because you've escaped it, but because your mental pattern has changed. The word literally becomes flesh again within your own consciousness, transforming thought into alignment. This is why scripture should be heard, not only read. When you speak it aloud, you activate the auditory cortex, merging comprehension with embodiment. It becomes more than information, it becomes internal sound, a sacred frequency vibrating through your body and nervous system. You begin to feel truth rather than chase it. The great mistake of modern spirituality is believing that understanding scripture equals hearing God. But true hearing happens when the word becomes rhythm, when verses move from concept to cadence, shaping your internal atmosphere. Over time, this frequency transforms your reactions, refines your focus, and teaches your mind to stay open long enough for God's whisper to fill it. In this rhythm, scripture stops being a book and becomes a living dialogue. The text turns to tone, and the tone to transformation. You start to realize that God doesn't only speak through the Bible, He speaks as it, every time your spirit tunes itself to its rhythm. The middle pause. Hearing God between tasks. Most people think hearing God requires isolation, but revelation often happens in the spaces between one task and the next, one breath and another. The middle pause is where divine communication hides in plain sight. It's not a long prayer or a formal ritual, it's the simple act of reclaiming presence in the middle of movement. When you interrupt your routine for 60 seconds of silence, you are telling your brain, this moment matters more than momentum. Neuroscience calls this micro-stillness. When practiced regularly, it lowers cortisol, rebalances the nervous system, and restores the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for awareness and discernment. What happens physiologically in that pause is extraordinary. The body resets from doing to being. Spiritually, that's where the whisper becomes audible again. God often speaks not during your striving, but in your stopping. Judith Beck would say this moment trains the mind to disengage from automatic thoughts. You step out of emotional reactivity and into conscious perception. The more you do it, the more your mind begins to anticipate stillness as nourishment rather than interruption. You become aware of subtle insights, patterns, or inner nudges that were invisible during the noise. Imagine a day structured not by exhaustion, but by sacred intervals, short pauses of recalibration where awareness meets eternity. That's not inefficiency, that's mastery. It's how you bring the presence of God into the fabric of ordinary time. The middle pause reminds you that the divine doesn't live in distant temples or planned devotionals. It moves with you, waiting patiently in the breath between your thoughts. The night mirror, replaying God's whisper. As night falls and the world begins to dim, something within you seeks to settle, but the mind rarely allows it. Thoughts replay the day like a restless echo. What went wrong? What was left undone? What could have been said differently? Yet this moment, when most people drift into mindless fatigue, is sacred territory. The night isn't only for rest, it's for reflection. The night mirror is where your soul replays God's whisper before sleep, allowing what was divine to sink deeper into consciousness. Neuroscience reveals that the brain consolidates memory and emotion during sleep. Whatever you meditate on before closing your eyes becomes the blueprint your subconscious carries into the night. If you fill that space with worry, you'll reinforce anxiety. But if you fill it with gratitude, scripture, and silence, your mind begins to reprogram itself toward peace and spiritual clarity. Joe Dispenza would call this neuroplastic imprinting, the subconscious learning new emotional habits while the body rests. Before sleep, take a single verse that spoke to you during the day. Don't analyze it. Just repeat it slowly, rhythmically, until it begins to feel like breath. Let gratitude accompany it, thanking God not for perfection but for awareness. In that stillness, the mind and spirit merge, and divine instruction continues long after you've fallen asleep. In the night mirror, God doesn't just speak, He rewrites. Every reflection becomes a recalibration, every quiet moment a seed for tomorrow's clarity. The body rests, but the soul continues its dialogue. When you awaken, what once felt like uncertainty begins to unfold as understanding, because truth planted in reflection always blooms in the morning. The battle within the quiet. Silence looks peaceful from the outside, but inside it can feel like war. The moment you try to be still, the mind rebels. It floods you with thoughts, memories, plans, and fears, as if it's terrified of losing control. This is the battle within the quiet, the uncomfortable threshold between mental noise and divine awareness. Many give up at this point, mistaking silence for emptiness, not realizing it's the furnace where transformation begins. From a psychological view, the brain has been conditioned to associate stillness with boredom or danger. When nothing is stimulating it, it panics, seeking distraction. Andrew Huberman explains this as a neurological adaptation to constant input. The brain believes silence is unsafe because it's unfamiliar. Spiritually, this is the same resistance that has always stood between the soul and communion. It's not that God is absent, it's that the mind is detoxing from addiction to control. Judith Beck would describe this stage as cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that comes when old mental patterns collide with new awareness. The ego resists surrender because it equates noise with existence. But if you can endure that internal chaos without fleeing from it, something powerful happens. The noise begins to dissolve. The thoughts still come, but they lose authority. Beneath them, you start to sense a deeper current, one of peace, observation, and quiet certainty. The battle within the quiet isn't a sign of failure, it's a rite of passage. It's the mind learning to bow to spirit. Once you pass through it, you stop fearing silence and begin craving it, because that's where presence lives. The voice of God doesn't compete with the storm inside you, it waits until you've learned to stop feeding it. In the end, the victory isn't in silencing the noise, it's in realizing you were never the noise to begin with. When faith meets the nervous system. Faith is often spoken of as a belief of the soul, but few realize it's also an experience of the body. Every thought of trust or fear sends a signal through your nervous system. Your breath, your heartbeat, your posture, all translate spiritual states into physical ones. When anxiety rises, your shoulders tense, your breathing shallows, your focus narrows. When faith deepens, your body loosens, your breathing steadies, your awareness expands. Hearing God isn't just a mental act, it's physiological alignment. The nervous system functions as the bridge between the unseen and the seen. Andrew Huberman's research shows that slow rhythmic breathing activates the parasympathetic response, shifting the body from fight or flight to calm attention. Spiritually, this mirrors surrender. It's the physical expression of, Be still and know. The moment you slow your breath, you're not just calming anxiety, you're creating the conditions for revelation. The mind quiets, the body steadies, and the inner frequency matches peace. Faith, then, is not merely conviction, it's coherence. When belief and body move in harmony, divine awareness becomes tangible. Prayer ceases to be words thrown into the air and becomes presence felt in the body. This is why posture matters, why breath matters, why rhythm matters. The body is not an obstacle to spirituality. It's an instrument. And just as a musician tunes their instrument before playing, you tune your nervous system before hearing. When faith meets physiology, something sacred happens. You stop chasing experiences of God and start embodying them. The heart rate slows, the muscles unclench, and suddenly awareness opens like a window to still air. The nervous system becomes a sanctuary. In that moment, peace is not imagined, it's inhabited, and the voice of God doesn't descend from above. It arises from within the stillness you've learned to hold. The echo effect, recognizing God in patterns. When you begin to walk in rhythm, life stops feeling random. Coincidences turn into patterns, and what once looked like chance begins to feel like conversation. God rarely speaks in isolated sentences. He speaks in echoes. You'll see the same verse appear in different places, the same thought whispered through different people, the same inner nudge repeated in various forms. At first it feels subtle, but once your awareness sharpens, you realize divine communication has been hiding in repetition all along. Neuroscience calls this selective attention. The brain starts to recognize patterns based on what it values. What you focus on, your mind amplifies. Spiritually, that's how discernment grows. The more your heart desires clarity, the more your awareness begins to catch the divine fingerprints in what once seemed ordinary. You start to see a word in a book, hear a phrase in a conversation, and feel a peace that confirms alignment, all connecting to a single thread of meaning. The echo effect teaches that God doesn't need to shout when you've learned to listen deeply. His voice reverberates through the natural flow of life. It's not mystical exaggeration, it's recognition. You've trained your attention to detect the pattern of presence. Judith Beck would compare it to cognitive reappraisal. The moment the mind replaces randomness with meaning, anxiety loses its grip. You begin to see purpose where chaos used to be. As this awareness strengthens, your trust deepens. You stop begging for signs because the signs are already everywhere, woven into time, memory, and motion. God's voice becomes less like an event and more like a rhythm quietly guiding your steps. And soon, what once felt like coincidence begins to sound unmistakably like conversation, the kind that turns everyday existence into divine dialogue. Living in alignment, not interruption. The greatest mistake most people make in their spiritual life is compartmentalization. They separate prayer from work, meditation from action, faith from routine. But God never intended His presence to visit you occasionally. He designed it to flow through every moment, like breath. Living in alignment means moving from fragmented spirituality to continuous awareness, where daily life itself becomes communion. When you live in alignment, you stop treating devotion as an event and start seeing it as a state. You no longer ask, "When will I hear God again?" because your rhythm keeps you within His frequency. Every task becomes prayer when done with awareness. Washing dishes, driving, working, all become extensions of stillness. You begin to move from the center instead of chasing meaning outside it. This is not mysticism, it's mindfulness with divine direction. Andrew Huberman might describe it as sustained attention, the ability to hold focus without tension. Spiritually, it's sustained presence. You're no longer pulled between heaven and earth, you carry heaven into earth. The same neuroplasticity that forms habits of distraction can form habits of awareness. Through repetition, your mind learns that stillness isn't something you must return to. It's something you never leave. Living in alignment changes your energy. You stop reacting to life as if it's happening to you and start participating as if it's happening through you. Distraction becomes a cue to realign, not a failure. Every interruption becomes an invitation to awareness. And soon, life itself becomes your rhythm. An unbroken prayer, a silent symphony of motion and meaning, where your mind, body, and spirit finally move as one. The moment heaven speaks back. There comes a point in the rhythm when the seeking stops. You no longer chase signs or strain to hear. You move through your day with quiet confidence, and suddenly, heaven answers. Not through thunder, not through visions, but through a peace so precise it silences every question. This is the moment heaven speaks back, not because you demanded revelation, but because you created resonance. You became still enough for the eternal to find echo in your awareness. The conversation between you and God was never broken, it was simply misaligned. When your rhythm matches His, everything speaks, the wind, the scripture, the silence itself. You start to feel the divine pulse running through ordinary moments. The more you live this way, the less you depend on emotion to confirm His presence. Faith matures into recognition. You realize heaven has been answering not in words, but in alignment, in timing, in the subtle orchestration of your days. Neuroscience might describe this as full integration, the mind, body, and spirit working as one coherent system. But spiritually, it's restoration. It's the human soul remembering its original language. In this awareness, you no longer live searching for God. You live as His reflection. Every act of kindness, every thought of gratitude, every breath of stillness becomes dialogue. This is the culmination of the daily Bible rhythm, not perfection, but presence. You stop striving to hear God and start walking with Him. The voice you once strained to find is now inseparable from your own heartbeat. Heaven no longer feels distant because you've learned to live in tune with its rhythm. And as your life settles into that harmony, you understand the final truth. God never stops speaking. You just finally learn to listen.